What's up, everybody, and welcome back to the Duke Wisdom Podcast. Got a few things to talk about for today's episode with the NBA Finals coming up on Thursday and a few Blue Devils involved in that in all sorts of different ways. Also, K Academy got going last week and has concluded with its champion, coached by Tre Jones and Sheldon Williams, as well as I want to talk about that list I keep dropping. If you guys read the articles, ranking the top 15 players of the 2020s so far. This is the third time now that I've dropped that one. So I started it actually started as a top 10 list I think that was post 2022, it was a top 10 list. And then post 2023, it became a top 15 list. It's still just a top 15 list, but it's updated to include new players or updated rankings, depending on how the guys played during the 23-24 season. But first of all, let's start by talking about K Academy. So all the guys came in, well, most of the guys from the team came in for K Academy. Got to see Common Malawach there, which is nice to see Common there because he'll be playing in the Olympics for South Sudan this year, so he won't be working out with the team all summer. So I think it's important for him, even if he's not working out, he's not getting reps in practice necessarily. I think it's important to see him with his teammates, with former players in the Brotherhood, kind of getting acclimated to the atmosphere at Duke and Cameron. And I just think that's really crucial to have him because he's going to be such a crucial part to this year's team. So having him there, but also having some of the transfers and other freshmen coming in for the first time. I think a lot of these freshmen know each other and have communicated throughout the commitment process. Obviously, Pat Gongba and Darren Harris played at the same high school. There's connections like that. Isaiah Evans and Cooper Flagg have been around each other plenty, being Slam All-Americans, McDonald's All-Americans. They've seen a lot of each other. They've been around each other a lot. And so it's no stretch of the imagination to say that the freshmen are at least familiar. They're familiar with each other. However, I think it's really important here at K Academy in the era of the transfer portal to see these transfers coming in. We got the official decision. I don't think there was really ever much question, but the official decision from Sion James that was him pulling out of the NBA draft and officially deciding that he will be playing at Duke next season. I don't think that was ever really in question. But seeing Sion at K Academy and Mason Gillis and Malik Brown, those are all big time things. And I love that. And I love that they got to be there with the freshmen, be there with the returning guys, Caleb Foster and Tyrese Proctor. I liked seeing the connection between Proctor and Malawach, two NBA Global Academy guys, just Global Academy in different continents, but there's still some form of connection there. And I love that John Shire has gone to recruit these NBA Global Academy. He was trying to get into France for this class as well. It didn't work out for him, but John's not shied away from the international game. And Coach K would, dip his toes into the international waters a little bit, but he wasn't very committed. He wasn't exactly like pulling in top level talent guys like Malawach or even like Tyrese Proctor. And John Shire is tapping into the international game in a way that I think is very significant. And I think it will definitely benefit Duke in the long run because you see how many of these players are being successful NBA players, how many of these guys are just so immensely talented, and the rest of the world is catching up the United States in basketball. So why not, if you're a collegiate coach, especially a collegiate coach at such a high-profile institution and program, why wouldn't you? Because you see Gonzaga pull in so many guys from international places, and it's like, well, if they can do it, obviously Duke can too, but Duke honestly has the chance to pull guys who just wouldn't go to college at all, that don't need it. Like Common Malawach doesn't need it. He'd be a top 5 pick probably next year without it. But with it, who knows? And he could develop into something great. We'll see how it goes. Tyrese Proctor's taken a little bit longer maybe than expected in terms of turning into an NBA first round pick. I am of the belief that he still will be after this upcoming season. He's still the age of a college sophomore, so there's no reason to worry or to fret or anything like that. So that's kind of the big gist of K Academy. got to see some cool clips of like Marshall Plumlee coaching, Grayson Allen coach. I got to talk about that one picture that Duke posted of Grayson where they made him look way older than he actually is. And I don't know how that one actually made it onto being posted. I don't know how people looked at that and thought, yeah, this is the one. If you guys know what I'm talking about, you'll know what I'm talking about. I'm not going to go on like a huge tangent about this, but it was kind of wild. Anyway, getting to see a lot of the former guys was cool. Quinn Cook there, Andre Dawkins there, as a couple of names of guys that I'd like to see maybe on Duke's coaching staff one day in some sort of role or another. But always fun seeing that. Always fun. You know, I looked at the prices for the first time at K Academy. I don't think I'd ever actually looked at the price. It's like $13,000 for the entire experience. You have to be 35 years old to compete in it. And so, you know, I'm now about 13, 14 years away from being able to compete in K Academy, and I got to start saving my money now, I guess. that's what I've gathered from that. But K Academy's over. I want to talk about jersey numbers a little bit. I don't remember if I talked about jersey numbers at all, but we got some. I think I did, but some unique jersey numbers. Number 18, Mason Gillis. I know I probably already talked about this again, but I just love the number 18. Like, that's maybe the oddest jersey number that will be worn in Duke basketball history, and I got to respect it. I just got to shout out to the number 18 for Mason. It's beautiful. Anyway, let's keep going. Let's move on to the NBA Finals discussion. That's where I want to go next with this. So, Finals discussion, I'll have an article coming out. I'm not going to say like a ton, honestly, but I've got an article coming out for the North Carolina Sports Network probably later this week, or maybe even today, I'm unsure. But at some point this week, that's kind of detailing the brotherhood in the NBA Finals and kind of some of those significant numbers and how many, you know, cool statistics to point out. But there's a lot of presence here for Duke. This is kind of a lose-lose situation if you're a Carolina fan, right? Because Duke has Jason Tatum, who could very well be their first Finals MVP if Boston wins. And then in Dallas, you've got Kyrie Irving, who's looking for his second ring and cementing what is almost assuredly a Hall of Fame legacy. Then you've got Derek Lively, who has undergone just significant personal, heartbreak, really, with the passing of his mother right before the playoffs. And then his spectacular rookie season is in the finals. And then beyond the court, you've got Emile Jefferson on the coaching staff, and you've got Steve Pagliuca, a Duke graduate who is a co-owner of the Boston Celtics. His sons, of course, are Joe and Nick Pagliuca. Both were walk-ons at Duke. Nick was a national champion back in 2015. So there's just so many connections going on in these NBA Finals if you're Duke. And I think it's interesting. I wanted to create a poll, and I put it up on Twitter. I don't remember the exact end result, but I know for a while it was a straight up 50-50 split on whether Duke fans wanted Boston to win or Dallas. And I was actually a little surprised by this. I thought that Boston would win this just easily because I think Duke fans have strown to liking the Celtics. They have gone to the point where they're like, oh, we really want Jason Tatum to get this. But I think there's a lot of love, but especially for Derek Lively, but for Kyrie and Derek and wanting to see Dallas win that. I'm on the train that if I had to pick, it'd probably be the Mavericks. But that's me coming from a Milwaukee Bucks fan standpoint because Boston has kind of been a rival of the Bucks, and so it's a lot easier to see Dallas win. I'm also of the opinion that Luka Doncic should have won MVP this year. I think absolutely should have won MVP this year, and I think he has proven that he was the best player this season here in the postseason. That's kind of aside the Duke point, though. So for me, I want Dallas to win. If I'm expressing any sort of bias here, I'm not, this is Duke wisdom, not some sort of NBA coverage. So I don't feel scared saying that. But I think that it's going to be such an interesting and such a significant series for Duke in the NBA. I mean, all eyes on the finals, and you see all these prominent Duke players. Like, it's not just a bench player here or a two-way player there. We're talking about two of the probably the 3 or 4 best players in this entire series are former Blue Devils, and that's massive. Just seeing that play out, and that has a lot of recruiting impact, and it impacts because Duke's probably got 2 Hall of Famers playing in this final series. So that's massive. and I talked about that Mount Rushmore, last, I guess, a couple weeks ago, maybe now. I talked about that Mount Rushmore and whether Jason Tatum was at the top or Kyrie Irving is at the top. Well, this final series can certainly impact who ends up being the Duke and the NBA GOAT. If Boston wins, I'm prepared to say it's Tatum. And if Dallas wins, I'm prepared to say it's Kyrie. I think either way, Grant Hill kind of loses a little bit of footing in this conversation. But shout out to the OG and certainly a guy who held that GOAT position down for a very, very long time. And one of my favorite players of all time, Grant Hill. So that's sort of a finals look. Now let's get into what's probably going to be the lengthier discussion of this, which is discussing and breaking down my picks of ranking the top 15 players of the 2020s so far.
Want to join a community of Duke accounts publishing news, theories, and predictions on Duke athletics? Join the Duke Wisdom Network. Just go to dukewisdom.org/join network today and fill out the form with your name and social media. Or you can DM at Duke_Wisdom on Twitter or Instagram. Become a part of the community of Duke fans publishing their takes today. Again, that's dukewisdom.org/join network or DM at Duke_Wisdom on Twitter or Instagram.
So here's where I'm at. I had some close calls here, some potentially unpopular calls. I've had people look at it. If you're listening to this, you maybe already have read the article, seen the rankings, but I urge you to keep listening because I want to make my case for some of these players. So some of my basic honorable mentions that I had out there were Dariq Whitehead, 8 points per game in his 1 year in 2023. A fantastic player, could shoot the three ball super well, but was he really the guy? He didn't live up to what he was supposed to be, and a lot of that was because of the injuries. I wanted to at least give him a shout out. Caleb Foster ended up on my honorable mentions as well, 8 points per game this past season. Injuries hurt him at the end of the year as well. He wouldn't have ended up on this list. I think that this time next year, he might end up on this list, but right now, not so much. Then I also had Jordan Goldwire on there and all ACC defense selection back in 2021. Goldwire didn't average a lot of points, but he did have significant impact defensively. He's only one of, I think, two guys, basically, who were on my honorable mentions that had any sort of ACC accolade that didn't actually end up making the list. Goldwire and somebody else who I'll mention and discuss a little more at length later. The other honorable mention that I'm not going to talk too much about is Ryan Young. Again, not a whole lot of points per game, but I think an effective and impactful player in the rotation. He just didn't score enough, really, to merit any more discussion than just being mentioned briefly. Derek Lively was my top honorable mention, and I've had a few people say that they think they would probably swap in Derek Lively. And I thought about this maybe the most out of any of these rankings. Derek Lively's impact by the end of the season 100% merited him being on this list, him being in the top 15 somewhere. There's zero doubt in my mind. Defensively speaking, he might be the best defender Duke's had so far in the 2020s, at least second to Mark Williams. And so it's really tough to leave him off and keep him as an honorable mention. But for me, it was there was a good stretch of the season where Derek Lively wasn't a starter. To begin the year, Derek Lively was struggling. He really couldn't find his footing or his placement. And I'm not sure how much of that was because Lively just hadn't caught up to the college game yet, or was Shire and company didn't have a thorough plan for how they needed to use Derek yet. I think maybe a little bit of both, but I think by the time Derek caught up, if Derek had played the way he did in the last 12 or so games, 15 games of the season, if he'd played like that the entire year, I have zero doubts Derek Lively ends up on this list. But the Derek Lively from the first 20 games of the season I don't even think he gets an honorable mention nod. So the thing for me was looking at the counting stats, and you don't always want to look at the counting stats. He averaged about 2.5 blocks, which is ridiculous. That is his biggest claim to be on the list. Then 5 points, 5 rebounds. And it's 5 points, 5 rebounds. He's really good field goal percentage, really good block count. But those numbers, when you look at the guys, and I'm going to talk about the guys that I put on the list over him, how can I put a guy averaging 5 and 5 over him? I don't know. By the end of the year, Derek Lively was certainly better than the guy I have at 15 and the guy I have at 14, I think. Like at their end of the year self, Lively was better. But if we're talking full body of work, and Derek Lively didn't have a very large full body of work because it was just one season, and he played a lot of it on like he wasn't playing a lot of minutes for most of the season. So it is a very small, narrow kind of pool to choose from in terms of his performances. And he certainly had his highlights, but I think if you're looking at the entire season and his entire time at Duke, again, I cannot take, actually, I didn't mention this at the top of this discussion, but I should have. I'm not taking into account at all his time in the NBA, how well he's panned out in the NBA versus other guys. It is just his time at Duke. And yes, team accomplishments are taken into account, so that ACC tournament championship is something he has. But ultimately, that and then the ACC all defensive selection, but I just couldn't do it. The numbers weren't there. He wasn't consistent throughout the entire season. And for me, the guy I put at 15 was more consistent throughout the entire season. And the guy I put at 14, while not consistent, had higher highs than either the guy I had at 15 or Lively. Lively was my top honorable mention. Now, I talked about the guy at 15. The guy at 15 is DJ Stewart. Now, DJ Stewart, I can see some pushback being here because Duke was so bad during the 2020-2021 season. But Stewart was runner-up for ACC Freshman of the Year. And honestly, in a year where Duke performed as Duke normally does, he probably wins ACC Rookie of the Year. I mean, Scotty Barnes was playing for Florida State. He only averaged like 10 points a game. So if you normally had a Duke guy with 13, 14 points per game and he was like on a top 10 Duke team, as they normally would be, that's an ACC Freshman of the Year in that season. And so Stewart did not benefit from team performance. I don't think he was bad. I think that maybe, honestly, his statistics might have benefited a bit from the fact that Duke just wasn't so good and they didn't have a lot of guys taking too many shot opportunities, scoring too many points. There's one other guy who played a significant role in that team that's going to appear higher on this list. You can guess who that is. But Stewart, for me, while not an incredibly efficient player, wasn't an incredibly inefficient player either. In the some highlights they did have that season, Stewart played a really crucial role in those moments. He hit some big threes. He had some big dunks, some big plays. I hate that he struggled to get into the NBA the way he has after being a one and done. And, you know, DJ, there was a lot of discussion about the fact that he should have come back. And had he come back for a sophomore season, I have no doubt in my mind he'd be a lot higher on this list. And speaking of guys who, if they come back for a sophomore year, would be a lot higher on this list, the guy I have next at 14, Trevor Keels, he'd fit that bill as well, same as DJ Stewart. Now, Keels, and I mentioned this earlier when I was talking about a guy at 14, where it was like Trevor Keels, not consistent at all. I mean, he started his freshman season with a game against Kentucky where he scored 25 points against a top 10 team in the nation. It ended up being a 2 seed by the end of the year. He had games like that. He scored 19 in the Final Four game against Carolina. I never would have guessed in that game that Roach would fall flat on his face. So would Wendell Moore. So would AJ Griffin. Mark Williams would basically be a non-factor the entire game. And one of the only 2 saving graces for Duke in that entire game was Trevor Keels. And so Keels was really good in his best moments. He had a really high-scoring game at Pittsburgh in a game that clinched the ACC regular season title for Duke for the first time in 12 years. He had massive games, but he also just had no-shows. He had games where he just couldn't hit anything from 3, where you'd almost cringe to see a 3-point shot go up. He was an interesting player, one of the only players I've ever seen only shoot layups underhanded. A stout player, a very good and talented player, but again, another player that would have benefited from coming back for a sophomore season and most certainly would have gone up in this list. He averaged like 11 point something points per game for a Final Four team. And for me, that right there was enough to stick him over Stewart and Lively. I couldn't put him any higher than that, even though his point per game totals were higher than on the same team as the guy that I have right above him. The guy I have right above him is AJ Griffin at 13. AJ only averaged 10 points a game, so he did average less than Trevor, but he was a more consistent starter. He had a slow start to the year because of injuries, but by the end of ACC play, I mean, consistent 20-point games or like 18, 19-point efforts. Probably the best shooter in the entire ACC that year. AJ Griffin earned himself a slot at 16. He was, without those injuries, was a potential top 5 pick in the draft that year, but he fought through those injuries, and he still had a very productive, very good season as a starter for a Final Four team, averaging double digits, and that's what earned AJ Griffin the slot at number 13. At number 12, I had Cassius Stanley. I see so often the players from the 2020 team getting looked past, jumped over, and like, oh, I don't know about this guy. What did he really win? What did he have the opportunity to win, right? The ACC regular season, that's about it. And how many Duke players since 2010 have done that? Very few, right? So can't hold that against him. Potentially had the momentum for that team to win the ACC tournament, to make some sort of push in the NCAA tournament. I'm not of the belief that they were going to win the national title, but I think they could have made a Final Four push potentially. But still, that team gets looked over a lot, and we'll really look into that with another guy toward the top. But for Stanley, it happens a lot because people forget about Cassius Stanley. He wasn't the best player on the team. He wasn't the second best player on the team. He was the third, though. He averaged 12 points per game for that team. And averaging 12 points as a third best player for a team that was going to be a 2 or 3 seed is something that you can't just look past. Look at it like a 2 seed in 2012. Who was the third best player for that team? Like Seth Curry or Mason Plumlee? Are we looking past that? I don't think so. You know, who was the third best player in 2017? That's a 2 seed. That was Grayson Allen. Are we looking past that? Not really. But who's the third best player for the 2022 team is Mark Williams. Do we look past what Mark Williams did? Absolutely not. So I think we shouldn't look past what Cassius Stanley did. He was a very good player. The advertisement for Stanley was that he wasn't an above average 3-point shooter, that he was a very, kind of 3-point shooter, but he ended up being very good, like a really dependable 3-point shooter, actually. And his above the rim antics were ridiculous. I mean, constantly had these stellar plays above the rim. Cassius Stanley, for me, a very underrated player. He earned himself a slot at 12. And one could argue maybe he should have even been a little bit higher, because maybe an unpopular pick is Mark Mitchell, who I had at 11. So Mark Mitchell, let's just say, is one of the top 3 players to transfer from Duke ever, to transfer away from Duke. One of these, the number one guy undoubtedly is Jeremy Roach, and we'll get to him a little bit later. But Mark Mitchell, this might be it's probably an unpopular pick because a lot of people just didn't think Mark Mitchell was good. They didn't think he was good. And I disagree. I've spoken at length about how I thought Mark Mitchell was good. He just didn't fit the system. There were things that just went awry that were kind of out of his control. There was a good stretch of this season where Mark Mitchell was getting player of the games and scoring over 20 points almost every game there for 4 or 5. And he had a very good season, averaging over 11 points per game. Then he averaged about 9 points a game as a freshman. No, he never really got an individual accolade of any kind, which makes him the first guy on this list that I can say that about. And actually the only guy on this list, I think, that I can say that about. But I think he got snubbed in his freshman year for the all-freshman team, or at least for the all-defense team. His defense kind of slowed down as a sophomore. We didn't see what we thought we could get out of Mark Mitchell. But at the end of the day, you have to take into account guys who stay longer. His freshman year was definitely worse than pretty much all these guys, right? Except for maybe Lively. I probably would have still stuck him over Lively, but that would have been a discussion. I honestly, I maybe would have put Lively over him now this year, now that I thought about it. I think last year, actually, I had Mark over Derek. But after his sophomore year, when you get a 2-year starter averaging double digits on his career, he's got to rise up a little bit, right? He's got to rise up a little bit. And he's a 2-year starter without fail, constantly there, and a double-digit scorer. And so for me, Mark Mitchell fell at 11. At 10, another guy who's fallen short, a little bit short of expectations, but I think will certainly rise this time next year, is Tyrese Proctor, the only current player on this list. Proctor cracked into the top 10. He probably should have been a little bit higher. We expected an All-American season. Some people expected an All-American season. I didn't expect that. I expected maybe an All-ACC season. He fell short of that even, but Proctor was still good. He still improved. And I urge people to shy away from the narrative that Tyrese Proctor got worse his sophomore year. He certainly did not. He got a lot better. He just didn't take the he didn't take the shots. He didn't have the same offensive aggressiveness that maybe he should have had. And a lot of that boiled down to the fact that Duke was just so crowded at his position. I mean, it was a very maybe ill-planned team positionally. And so I think that he kind of fell into the shadows a bit, offensively speaking, because of that. But he's a really effective defender. He's a really effective passer, a really effective player. And he's averaged just about double digits per game on his career with good assist numbers. He's been a very good defender. I think Tyrese Proctor will move up into the single digits, wherever that may be, by this time next year. But for me, he was just better than Mark Mitchell through 2 years. And so I had to put him at 10 if Mitchell was 11. At 9 is the only new addition to this top 15 at all, and it's Jared McCain. Jared McCain averaged 14 points per game. He had a bit of a rocky and a slow start to his freshman season, his only season in Durham. But McCain ended up being one of the best three-point shooters in the country, one of the best three-point shooters Duke has had, probably the best three-point shooter Duke has had in the 2020s, but one of the best they've had in ever, period, I think. Just a plethora of 30-point games, 2 of them in the NCAA tournament. He tied Zion Williamson's NCAA tournament freshman scoring record and his just straight-up freshman scoring record with 35 against Florida State this year. McCain was a prolific shooter, but could also get to the rack. He did have his struggles kind of if he put the ball on the floor too much, that he'd get a little sloppy and turn it over. He's not really point guard, not much of a distributor, but a really solid shooter. He's got good frame. He can defend well. And he was certainly a massive, massive fan favorite. I showed this list to my brother, and he was like, when he saw McCain at 9, he's like, oh, he's got to be higher than that. And I was like, well, tell me who he's above, because of the 8 players I have above him, I don't think there's any case. And starting at number 8 is Mark Williams. Mark Williams, the ACC Defensive Player of the Year in 2022. He was a terrific player in the dunker spot that has served as kind of John Shire's model for how he wants to play. Because you get Mark Williams in that last year at K, and then immediately after, John Shire sort of replicates that with Derek Lively to a lesser extent offensively, but certainly to a defensive extent. And then he's now got Kamen Malowacz coming in next season to play a similar role. Last year was sort of the year where he missed that kind of guy. He didn't have that kind of guy. That's why Filipowski was forced to play out of position. But anyway, Mark Williams served as kind of the basis for that role at Duke in what has become a very obvious shoe-in kind of role that Duke wants every year now. But Mark Williams was terrific at it. He ended his career, I think, 6th or 7th all-time in blocks at Duke, and he only played 2 seasons. So that tells you enough right there. But the Defensive Player of the Year, Mark Williams, in the ACC, he was a finalist for National Defensive Player of the Year. He was one of the best centers in the ACC, a third-team All-ACC selection in his sophomore year. He had good numbers his freshman year, too. He's actually, I think, a better rebounder as a freshman than a sophomore. And a lot of that boils down to Paolo Banchero coming in and taking a lot of rebounds per game. But Mark was such a good player, such an effective player. And for him to only be 8th on this list is really telling to the amount of talent. And number 7 is a player who doesn't have the same level of team accomplishment as anybody else. It's Matt Hurt. If Matt Hurt had played a full season in either his freshman or his sophomore year, he's a 1,000-point scorer in 2 years, which is only 2 players to only play 2 years and get 1,000 points. That's Luke Kennard and Kyle Filipowski. Matt Hurt would be the 3rd if he had got the opportunity to play a full season in either of his seasons. He didn't get to play in the postseason. He is undoubtedly, in my mind, probably the best Duke basketball player of all time to never play in the postseason. And he led the ACC in scoring his sophomore year. Duke wasn't a very good team, but he was a very good player. I don't want it to mar that. You're like, oh, he's only doing that because Duke sucked. No, he was a just prolific shooter. He was such a good shooter. Just a phenomenal shot. If I had it my way, Matt Hurt would have shot every shot for the entire team because it almost didn't feel like it mattered how much defense was played on Matt Hurt. He was going to get his shot off. He was going to make it most of the time unless he was playing Carolina. He did not play well against Carolina, and I'm not really sure why that is. Pressure or whatever it was. But Matt was just a terrific shooter. He had almost an unblockable shot. I'm glad that he finally got some run with the Grizzlies this year. I would be remiss if I put him any lower than this. I think he could have gone one slot higher than this. But ultimately, I opted to go with Jeremy Roach at 6, and I opted to go with Roach over Hurt and Williams, not because I think he was a better player than either of them, but because his career accolades support it. Jeremy Roach is the only player on this list to graduate from Duke, but he will not end his career at Duke. He'll be at Baylor next season. But he did end his career at Duke, a graduate. He played 4 years. He's a 4-year starter. He scored 1,400 over 1,400 points in his career, a top 40 scorer in the history of the school. Jeremy Roach was fantastic. He played a massive role in bringing Duke to the Final Four in his sophomore season, and then was the bridge between eras between Coach K and John Shire. I've said that before, being the captain for Shire's first two teams and averaging 13, 14 points per game in either of those seasons, and then ultimately ended up being an All-ACC selection as a senior. Jeremy Roach was terrific, and his longevity helped propel him higher on this list. At number 5, just above him, another guy who, like Matthew Hurt, would have been a 1,000-point scorer had he played a full season in either his freshman or sophomore years, and that is Wendell Moore Jr. Wendell Moore didn't have crazy-looking numbers. Even in his junior season, when he was a second-team All-ACC selection, a national small forward of the year, Wendell Moore, only 13 points a game. It's nothing to write home about, but he was just such a terrific player. He had a triple-double early in the season against Campbell. He played a lot of point guard, was such a superb passer, great rebounder, could score when called upon, when needed to score, he would do that. And the improvement in his three-point shot was remarkable. I mean, a player that was the dictionary definition of just a kind of subpar wing shooter, and turned into a very, now I don't want to say elite, but a very, very good three-point shooter by his junior season, and he turned himself into a first-round pick. What Wendell Moore did was admirable. It's what you hope that a McDonald's All-American who kind of doesn't land the footing quite as well as you like him to as an underclassman. It's what you hope he does. He sticks around till his junior year and he gets things right and he becomes a first-round pick. And to me, Wendell Moore has always been the obvious comparison for what I think Tyrese Proctor will become this season and what Tyrese Proctor can be this season. And so that's a pretty lofty ceiling for Proctor because Wendell Moore ends up being 5th on this list. At 4, and I promised to talk about him earlier in the episode when I was talking about Cassius Stanley. At 4, I have Vernon Carey Jr., who is perhaps the most underrated star in Duke basketball history. He averaged 17 points and 9 rebounds a game, was Duke's best player, a consensus second-team All-American. He was National Freshman of the Year, would have been ACC Player of the Year had Coach K nominated him instead of Tre Jones, or him and Tre Jones, he would have been ACC Player of the Year. I have no doubt he was a unanimous selection of first team. Jones wasn't. Carey would have been the ACC's Player of the Year. He was a dominant force in the paint that could step out and hit some threes. He was an absolute tank. He played in the wrong era. A lot like Jahlil Okafor, he played in the wrong era, and that's why he didn't last in the NBA. But Vernon Carey was a terrific player at Duke, just a phenomenal freshman talent, one of the best freshman seasons in Duke basketball history. That's saying a lot because Duke is a school that has perhaps the highest quantity of good freshman seasons. So I think Vernon, it honestly pained me to put him only 4th. I'll explain why that is, but Carey had a terrific year that is up there for maybe even the best season any Duke player has had this decade. At 3, I went with Kyle Filipowski. He was 5th this time last year. Honestly, I kind of expected him to have a good enough season to be 1st, but he didn't do quite as well as we thought, but he played out of position. And he still was a consensus second-team All-American, right? He was an All-American. He was first-team All-ACC. He was still a terrific player, still Duke's best player for 2 consecutive seasons, something that hasn't been done since Reddick in 05-06. He was Duke's highest scorer in return in his freshman season in return for a sophomore season. That's something that hasn't been done since Johnny Dawkins in 83-84. And so Kyle Filipowski did things that we haven't seen in a long time. I mentioned earlier in the episode, he's one of 2 players to score 1,000 points and play at Duke for less than 3 years. He was magnificent, and his accomplishments were great. A lot of people would fight me on that. They'd say, well, he wasn't great. He was. He perhaps wasn't as good as he could have been. And he also, had his moments where he didn't look like the dominant best players that Duke is used to, but he was a very effective one. And Duke went to the Elite Eight this year, and Kyle Filipowski was a fantastic player. He'll be a first-round pick this year. I've never seen a player get more in-house hate than Kyle Filipowski. I've talked about that time and time and time again. Filipowski ended up 3rd on my list, whether you believe it or not. And the reason he got over Carey, both of his seasons individually were worse than Carey's one season individually. But together with that you get rewarded for returning and being good again as a returner. And so for me, Filipowski getting, over 1,100 points in his career was something I was like, yeah, okay. He's got accomplishments from both the freshman and a sophomore season. That puts him over Carey. However, it did not put him over Tre Jones for me. Now, his freshman season was a lot better than Tre Jones' freshman season, albeit Jones was an all-freshman and all-defense selection in the ACC. He was such a shaky offensive player, but his improvement as an offensive player, particularly as a three-point shooter, helped earn Tre Jones ACC Player and Defensive Player of the Year in 2020. He's only one of two players to ever do that, Malcolm Brogdon being the other in 2016. Now, Jones is the only player so far this decade to be ACC Player of the Year from Duke. Now, we could argue that Paolo honestly was actually the best player in 22, but he didn't win it. But Jones is the only player to get ACC Player of the Year. He's a third-team All-American by the Associated Press. Just a terrific player. He's got to be one of the fan favorites of Duke fans. Obviously, a brother, Tyus, I hate that his career ended the way it did without getting a second stab at winning a national title, because that's why he came back. He was so emotionally distraught after losing as a freshman in the Elite Eight and not being able to hold up to that same standard that his brother left. And that's a big, huge reason why he came back for his sophomore season. And then to not get the opportunity to avenge that loss was heartbreaking, honestly. But Jones had a terrific 2 seasons at Duke. He's one of the only DPOYs they've ever had. He's one of many Player of the Years, but the only of the 2020s. Tre Jones was fantastic. Accolades-wise, Tre Jones should be first. Honestly, accolades, it should be Jones, then Filipowski 1-2. But I just kind of sat down and thought about eye test. Who did I actually think was Duke's best player of the decade? And that was who I have at number 1, Paolo Banchero. Now, Banchero is a second-team All-American, consensus second-team All-American. Now, Jones didn't get that. So we can argue that Jones was Player of the Year because it was a weaker season in the ACC, and that honestly, he really wouldn't have even been the Player of the Year had Carey been nominated. So if we're thinking of it like that, the 3 best individual seasons belong to Filipowski this past year, Vernon Carey in 20, and Paolo in 22. And if I just looked and kind of compared those, I was like, well, I think Kyle had the worst of those 3. Between Vernon and Paolo, I think Paolo was a bit better. And so also Paolo was the best player on a Final Four team, which carries a lot of weight to me. And I think Paolo was just such a talented, good player. I mean, there's no player that was more skilled and a better hooper than Paolo Banchero was in his single season in Durham. So Coach K's final All-American is the best player of the 2020s still for me. That could change next year. Who knows? Cooper Flagg I expect to see on this list this time next year. I expect to see Kaman Malawach on this list. I expect to see at least one other new guy, Caleb Foster, perhaps, probably. And I expect to see Tyrese Proctor move up on this list. And so it'll change, and I enjoy doing this every season. I enjoy breaking it down and kind of explaining my picks. If you disagreed with me on anything, let me know in the YouTube comments or leave a comment on Spotify or Apple. I appreciate your feedback. And I'll be back on Thursday to talk about another one of these lists. Again, sort of the top 25 players for the 2010s, a list that I'm hoping to drop before that episode drops as well. So thank you guys for listening. As always, make sure to follow or subscribe to the podcast wherever you're listening, whether that be Apple, Spotify, YouTube, or Amazon. And make sure to follow Duke Wisdom on Instagram or Twitter. And thanks so much, and I'll talk to you guys later.